All right, I see lots of folks joining, so I know we're a few minutes over already, so I'm just going to jump right in, and hopefully folks can still get settled in while we're going through housekeeping stuff. So welcome to the Collaborative Science for Story series. This is Nick Sobral with the Science Collaborative. Today's webinar features a collaborative research project that assessed mangrove recovery at the Jobos Bay Reserve in Puerto Rico and the Rookery Bay Reserve in Florida, leading to more holistic decision-making strategies for mangrove restoration and adaptive management. You'll hear more detail from the members of the project team in a moment, but before we get started, I just have a few quick housekeeping items, including an introduction to the reserve system, the Science Collaborative, and this series. So the National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a national network of 30 unique research reserves, as shown on this map, with more on the way. It's a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit at each site. And each reserve includes programs focused on the activities that you see on the slide there on the left-hand side. Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series features project teams supported by the Science Collaborative, program staff, and partners, and speakers share their unique approaches to addressing current coastal and estuarine management issues. And if that sounds interesting to you, please feel free to join us for future webinars to learn more about how these methods can be integrated into your work. So a quick note here on program learning. Webinars are a valuable learning opportunity for our program. Insights from speakers and participants like you can help inform how we support others in doing collaborative science. For example, the development of future workshops or webinars and resources such as tools, tips, and case studies to add to our guide to collaborative science, which is open access. With that in mind, I want to inform attendees that any insights or feedback that you share, for example, in chat or via a webinar survey or a poll, which we have some coming later, so be ready, may be used for program learning and development. Please note that if we capture a direct quote from you that we'd like to use for learning purposes, we will reach out to you beforehand and seek permission and provide an explanation of its use. All such quotes will be used anonymously, and we're grateful for the opportunity to learn alongside all of you. So lastly, some housekeeping notes. All attendees are muted upon entry. We'll be collecting presentation-related questions via the Q&A feature in your console. You can enter questions for presenters as they occur to you throughout the webinar, and we'll plan to discuss as many as we can following the presentation at the end. Chat is visible to all, so please feel free to use it amongst yourselves to chat and to ask organizers any support or technical questions that you might have. We'll be listening and quietly off camera when we get there. So, all right, with that, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. Danielle Ogurchek is a research assistant professor at Florida International University. Digna Rueda is a biological oceanographer with the University of South Florida. Sarah Mason is a senior policy associate in the Ecosystem Services Program at Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University. Britta Jessen is formerly with South Carolina Sea Grant, now with USGS. And Marissa Figueroa is the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the Rookery Bay Reserve. And I think with that, I'm handing it off to Danielle. So I will stop screen share.
Hi, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be sharing our project funded by the Science Collaborative. This is a 4-year project, the Mangrove Coast Collaborative, with the goal of understanding links between degradation, recovery, and community benefits. This Science Collaborative project is a partnership between 3 universities, Florida National University, Duke University, and the University of South Florida, and the 2 reserves within the system with coastlines dominated by mangrove ecosystems. That's Jobos Bay NERR in Puerto Rico and Rookery Bay in Southwest Florida. This project arose in the aftermath of the very active 2017 hurricane season. This hurricane season was the costliest on record for the United States. And in this, both Rookery Bay and Jobos Bay were impacted by Category 3 storm in Southwest Florida, here shown in the center of this image, and a Category 5 storm in Hurricane Maria, not yet formed yet in this image, forming off the coast at this moment on September 8th. So hurricanes disturbance is not novel to the Southeast and Caribbean region, right? Basically, if we look at this 170-year hurricane history of Category 1 through 5 hurricanes from NOAA, you'll see that approximately every 5 to 6 years, there's some sort of tropical storm hurricane impact to the area. So mangroves ecosystems are adapted to this type of frequent hurricane disturbance. You can see in this photo taken 5 years after the hurricanes in Rookery Bay, Florida, that yes, there's the presence of downwoody debris on the forest floor and broken limbs, but the canopy has quickly started to regain full coverage. It's not back to 100% canopy cover. It's probably closer to like 60% here, but we see a lot of recovery in both forests. However, there are plenty of places in each of the reserves that look like this, where they're standing impounded water, dead trees. There's no recruitment in the understory, and so in these forests, we'd say would be lacking, have lost ecosystem resilience. And so this project, we really wanted to understand how hurricane disturbance was interacting with other stressors on the landscape that were leading to these trajectories for the coastal ecosystem, and ultimately affecting loss of resilience and changes to ecosystem services that the communities in those reserves depend on. Managers are very interested in either preemptive actions to avoid the loss of ecosystem resilience, or information and tools that would help them restore following loss of ecosystem resilience. And in this project, we use collaborative science to support management decision-making. The MCC is broken into 4 tasks with 4 technical leads. First, to look at the where of damage and recovery in both reserves. Second, to understand what's happening on the landscape in terms of field assessments, so getting data driven in ecological driver modeling. Third, the effects to ecosystem services by building an evidence library and gap map. And finally, taking the outputs and information created in the first 3 tasks and understanding the ways in which managers might use that in decision-making frameworks. So to give you an outline of where we're going in this presentation, we had a lot of data created from this project, so we're not going to go into all of that. Instead, what we really wanted to focus on was the collaborative piece and how the MCC used co-production in the project. And so I'm going to turn it over after this next to our co-collaborative lead, Marissa Figueroa, to talk about the strategies and tools we used in co-production. And then each of the task leads are going to give some examples in the way we use collaboration to influence the approach in each task and subsequently the outputs. And finally, I'll wrap up the presentation today with a discussion of co-production and community building. So at this point is time for our first poll. I'm going to turn it over to Marissa.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. I hope everyone's doing well. And in the spirit of doing well, we wanted to ask y'all a quick question. So Danielle, if you could toggle over to our next slide, there we go. For our poll, we would love to know, who do you typically engage during your research projects? Are your engagements typically geared towards your core project team, or do you include some of those land managers? Or do you take it a step further and include experts or knowledge holders that advise your projects or your development? All right, how are we doing here? Okay, so from our results, it looks like most people are just engaging mostly with a core project team. Some folks are having a project team and integrating those land managers, but it seems like we have a nice group that's actually including both land managers and advisory groups. And that's amazing to hear, because we love to hear that you're integrating those perspectives and local knowledge holders, and is a perfect segue into our next slide. So overall engagement from the Mangrove Coast Collaborative can be explained best by what you're seeing here. This is our demonstration of our engagement for the project. So the initial need to explore co-production originated from the pre-project engagement, where we assembled our project team and used capacity funding from the NERRs Science Collaborative to discuss hurricane impacts with the local communities at both reserves. From there, we use that information to inform our project team and ultimately our application for the Science Collaborative funding that ultimately became the Mangrove Coast Collaborative. So upon receiving that funding in 2020, the project team began meeting monthly, and that's when our work began. It really began, and so did the formation of our 3 project advisory committees. So that really consisted of our local experts and knowledge holders, and they were consulted on product development. So the project team continued to make progress throughout the years and would engage these PACs during key points within the process. And these engagements were iterative, meaning that the questions were identified, they were brought up to our project advisory committees, discussion took place, and once feedback was provided, the task leads would assess that feedback within the scope of the project and would incorporate the feedback into that task. Now, if there were no more questions to be addressed on that product, then that task would be able to move on to the next part of their process, or we would expand the question in another form of engagement, which in our case is on the opposite side of our diagram here for those one-time or intermittent engagements as a workshop, or what we'll hear more about as a forum. Now, I did also want to take a moment to talk about how we've used some of our methods to engage our PACs. So on our next slide, we have some of these examples. The first one that we have here is during our kickoff meeting, we actually had time to establish what we called an advisory committee charter. Now, this is a living document that outlined our roles and responsibilities of each individual PAC member and did also define the purpose and structure of that PAC because there were multiple. And the second thing that we did to respect our committee's time is leading up to each of the PAC meetings, the project team would develop what we called a read-ahead document. And that would describe the progress or any announcements or updates on the task, and would also enable them to preview the ask from the committee. And that would be in a form of perhaps some discussion questions that would be informed by this iterative engagement that we discussed on that previous slide. And it was very useful because there was inevitably going to be someone who was unable to attend the session, yet they were still able to provide important input on the information that was shared during that session. The third thing that we did was following each of the meetings, the project team would prepare a response to the feedback and would format sometimes what we called a recommendation and response document that allowed for overall takeaways and transparency of how the input would be incorporated into the project. So now, with all that being said, we felt it was important to transition to hear how some of our technical leads provide or use that input that was provided by reserve staff and the PAC members to mold our outputs. So from here, I'll turn it over to our next example.
So I'm actually going to jump in here. I am not the technical lead for task 1. This is Digna Rueda Roa from USF, but she's not able to join us this afternoon. So I'm going to take you through the examples she laid out. Both reserves created habitat maps. These were annual mosaics of land cover habitat maps derived from worldview imagery. And these intents were to map changes at each reserve using this high resolution data from prior to the hurricane. So what earliest data we could find from the worldview satellite pre-2017 to the most recent data sets we could find. And throughout this process, Digna and the rest of the USF team used stakeholder feedback to improve the mapping product. So it started out by defining the regions of interest for both project teams during our first PAC meetings in January of 2021. We then found they needed to make class coverage adjustments, and that was done with the project team and land managers. After they had initial products, they realized really needed to do georeferencing refinements. It very much matters where you're on the landscape and how much mangrove is actually going to be classified as recovered or not recovered if you don't have good georeferencing. And then finally, they refined the final maps and within the past year. The overall result was more reliable maps that better reflected real world mangrove conditions. This had a lot of input from the project staff on both teams, but also the PAC members were able to help in terms of the classes they gave to each habitat map. So I want to give you an example here. So you can see what this looks like. The pink area is the mapped mangrove area, and the green is hardwood uplands. And so a lot of the algorithm in the beginning, we can see here in version 1 here of the map, really struggled to differentiate between mangrove trees and dense hardwood forest. And there's a real big difference we want to know in this project about mangroves. So they were able to successfully do that with feedback from the project team who had local knowledge of the habitats. And then another, the post-processing and georeference and mosaics can be seen over here in the examples of V3 versus V4. They're able to really refine and remove a lot of what would be noise within the maps as a result of this place-based feedback. I'd like to now turn it over to Sarah Mason to talk about examples of collaboration in task 3.
No. So input from the advisory committees also had a lot of influence over task 2, which was the ecological driver modeling and fieldwork, as well as task 3, the ecosystem service assessment. An important foundational piece of both of these tasks was the creation of conceptual models. And these conceptual models can be used in a variety of ways. Maybe some of you on this call have used them in the past, but what they are is essentially box and arrow diagrams that help visualize connections between different elements of a system. And so we use them to examine mangrove systems, both in terms of how elements of that mangrove ecosystem interact with and influence how hurricanes and subsequent ecosystem recovery result in changes to that ecosystem. But also we use them to look at how those changes to the mangrove system might influence social and economic outcomes that people care about, or in other words, ecosystem services that people care about. In both instances, we didn't want to develop these conceptual models in isolation in the project team. We wanted significant input from the experts we had gathered in the advisory committees to ensure that we're not only we're using the latest science to inform the model design, but also we're using a variety of perspectives to inform the development of these conceptual models. And for the ecological driver modeling, we co-created the model shown on this slide at a series of 2 workshops, one held at Rookery Bay and one at Jobos Bay. And through a series of interactive activities, we drafted and adapted the model shown here, which ultimately became the foundation for both selecting metrics that were measured during fieldwork and also designing the quantitative model that was used to assess the relationships between different elements of the system. If we go to the next slide, at those same workshops, we also co-designed the ecosystem services conceptual model, which is shown here. And again, this shows how changes to the mangrove system after storm impact and recovery might result in changes to ecosystem services that people care about. I know this is very small. If anyone wants to take a closer look at this model, I'm happy to drop the details in the chat of where you can find that. But this model was truly the foundation of the entire ecosystem service assessment piece of the project. So after co-designing this model with the workshop groups, we then used it within those groups as a starting point for a shared understanding of the social ecological mangrove system. And using that diagram as a grounding point, we were able to have further discussion about identifying the most important ecosystem services in these systems that are most valued by communities and most likely to be influenced by hurricane impacts. And also, we were able to really develop discussions about how to focus the development of an evidence library, which is a resource that we created with literature summaries for all the arrows in this conceptual model. And that ultimately allowed us to better understand how these different elements of the system are related according to existing science and as well as some anecdotal evidence from our experts and their partners. And also not only how the elements of the system are related, but also how they're likely to change after a storm. And so here, I'm now going to hand things over to Britta to talk about how engagements helped us think about management implications of all of the MCC's work.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, I'm here to explain where we went to kind of close the loop on this project, but I'm going to start again with how Danielle set us up in the storytelling, which is that here in the picture that you see, it's a group of scientists and managers together talking about what kinds of outcomes that we're all looking at an impacted mangrove and a key from that beach there. What are the impact and recovery trajectories of the mangrove systems? And I really wanted to highlight this quote here that mentions that people often representing diverse interests must define what constitutes desirable outcomes. And that really is the takeaway for Task Force. Let's get into the next slide from here. And after both with working with our project advisory groups and our technical advisory groups, we were able to start engaging conservation and resource managers in questions about how they are taking all of the quantitative and qualitative data that we're providing through this project and incorporating that into holistic decision making going forward. We wanted to hear from them what types of frameworks they're using to make these decisions, what are the key sources of information and the endpoints and end users that they're working with, and what are the constraints that they are feeling at this time for being able to make future-based decisions for mangrove systems. So we worked on developing a decision framework using this a basis called Resist, Accept, Direct, which has been helpful for identifying a variety of outcomes for different approaches to decision making in natural systems. We started first, Sarah and I worked with some students that reviewed potential options for restoration. We worked with the project advisory committees to identify what their needs are for information and what their resource needs are, as well as they manage systems on the ground in a recovery and also in a holistic resilience situation, which could also mean preparing better for future storms. We conducted focus groups and semi-structured interviews with resource managers that included PAC members and a broader group as well, both in Puerto Rico and in Florida. And as we were going through this whole process, what I've highlighted at the bottom there is that we learned that there is an immense value of making sure that the definitions were clearly defined for all groups of users. So definitions we were finding for terms such as, what do we define as a stressed system? What do we define as a degraded system? How do we describe mangrove die-off or mangrove encroachment? I'll give you one example. In Florida, if you use the term mangrove encroachment with resource managers, typically that means that there is kind of a ecotone of mangrove that's moving landward into salt marsh systems. But around the Jobos Bay, managers were using the term mangrove encroachment to actually mean humans that were cutting down and moving into formerly mangrove forested areas. So you can see how that term mangrove encroachment is going to be very different depending on which physical area you were part of. And all these other terms in terms of stress and degradation and loss were critical. So what we had as an unanticipated product of this task is that we actually formed what we call the definitions committee to come together. And again, it was a subset from our PAC group to really carefully define for this particular project how we were going to define our terms and how we were going to use them interchangeably when we were kind of crosswalking between these two sites and between different cultures too. And so that was kind of an unexpected win from the project. And I believe that Marissa is going to take us into a poll to see if that's familiar with any of you as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for that. So we did have the question then, knowing how we had to define some key language across our team, we wanted to know if that's something that your teams have experienced. Is this, have you needed to define key language across your expert groups, and how often have you done it? So is this yes all the time? Is it sometimes depending on the engagement? No, never really thought of it, or is it just not really applicable in your case? But we'd love to know how y'all are using language. All right. So from our results, it looks like we have quite a few people who have done it all the time. Some folks who've done it depending on the engagement. Thankfully, there is not anyone who answered no, never thought of it. And a couple folks who just mentioned it's just simply not applicable. So wow, that's really good to hear. And so we'd like to actually take now a moment to talk about a different product. So I'm going to turn it back over to Danielle here for our next slide.
Marissa, so I wanted to touch a little bit on some of the products, highlight one of the products of co-production, and that is the story map that we're in the process of creating. We created so much data and output from the MCC project, from the forecasts, and we thought the story map would be a way to get people with different varying levels of familiarity and expertise to dive into the data in an interactive way. So they have ability to look through sliders and look through all the maps, to go through different data points and kind of dive in and actually see what that looked like on the ground, as well as go into the ecosystem services library. So that, sorry, this is a really quick, but I think we can provide at the end what links to actually dive into the story map then. And all this, of course, will also be in our project webpage. A really important component of the project was our largest engagement we had in the project was the Mangrove Science and Management Forum, which we held in Miami over 2 days in the spring of 2024. We showed draft products and outputs from the MCC during this meeting. What the real purpose, though, was to increase the community of researchers and managers working collaboratively in mangrove ecosystem resilience. And not only did we, as this project spanned South Florida and the Caribbean, we wanted to look at the overall region and especially include other NERRs that have mangroves as part of their landscapes. Even though they're not the dominant part of their landscapes, they're mangroves that are moving into salt marsh. And so we had not only our advisory committee members attend this meeting, but we also had staff from the other 3 NERRs. We had staff from USVI who are currently doing work in mangrove restoration there, as well as a lot of local students who came to this meeting, total over 60 participants. And the first thing we did when we got there and welcomed all these folks is we said, why did you come to this meeting? Most of whom came in person to Miami. And because an investment of this time, what were you looking to get out of this experience? And overwhelmingly, this word cloud shows us that people are really interested in learning more in collaboration, in networking, in both management and science. And really importantly, they're interested in the future of mangroves. And at the end of this meeting, we, after many breakout groups and different activities where we got to, a lot of different people got to know each other better, we came up with a list of what I think are really kind of pressing issues and important considerations for future directions, where we wanted to make sure that we're managing with the best science and we're managing to current conditions, that since we can't really go back to historic conditions, that it's data driven with shared methodologies if we really want to understand what's happening across the Gulf and Caribbean regions, and that there's a really important piece of educating the public on these strategies that managers are using or going to use, whether that's resisting change or retreating, and that across the broad swath of the area, there's a real difference in how the communities think about mangroves, whether they're here in South Florida, where it's protected, you can't cut a mangrove on your property, up in North Florida, where some folks are considering them invasive. So we had a lot of great discussions, and these fueled us to think about where the community of practice in general is going in the future. And then finally, I want to just talk about this project had a ton of engagements that really shaped and kind of drove where the outputs of our projects went, with a lot of different user groups, starting with a capacity grant that Marissa mentioned, but 4 different funding sources basically supported the MCC project, all from the Science Collaborative, starting with the capacity grant and ending with a catalyst grant that amplified and kind of addressed some of the data gaps from the initial 3-year project. Over this timeline, we had 36 PAC members across the 3 different project advisory committees from representing 25 institutions. And we looked at the numbers at the end. We had about 90% retention of folks, which we thought was amazing, that over 4 years' time, people devoted all this time and wanted to continue to be involved in something that was not their, certainly was not necessarily within their job. But so that showed us a lot of interest and buy-in. And so during we just about a month ago had our last project advisory committee meetings with the 3 PACs. And during this meeting, we asked folks what they was most important that they got out of this. We gave them a poll as well. So we asked them from substance of the products. Was it the relationships that were most important part, or was it the process, like how the feedback that they provided was used in problem solving of the MCC? And we had a variety of responses, but overwhelmingly people said that relationships were the most important thing. And this struck me as being well in line with kind of what we already had seen, is that this idea that people wanted to connect was an important part of why our project really seemed to work, like the investment of everyone in it. And so this was kind of really nice to see this output at the end. And finally, I just really want to thank all these folks that really did devote their expertise and time to the project. So our project advisory committee members, I'd also really like to thank the Science Collaborative for all their support, as well as the great graphics that we have with our logo, as well as the several of our figures. And with that, I'd love to take any questions posed to the entire panel that's assembled here today.
Thanks, folks. Let me put on gallery view here. All right, let me open up Q&A. So feel free to drop questions in the chat, folks, and we'll go through them. Some nice comments in the chat so far saying, blown away how much work and tireless commitment has gone into this project. Congratulations. Having seen a lot of the work from the program side, I can agree, and also echo congratulations. Here's a question to, how do you see this work continuing now that the project is over? That's a good question.
I can take it in at the end of, I think, multiple ways. In one way that we're trying to expand the work was our second capacity grant we applied for collaboratively between Jobos Bay and Rookery Bay in 2023, brought the reserve staff from Mission Aransas, GTM NERR, Apalachicola NERR, as well as from USVI for folks who have been involved in the designation of the potential next reserve in the USVI, together for a workshop immediately on the backside of the Mangrove Coast Collaborative meeting. And we discussed where the community was going and came up with a lot of potential ideas. And one idea that the current reserves has put in is really needing to work on the mangrove standard operating procedures, SOP for vegetation monitoring to understand mangrove movement and migration. So that's one project that we put in for future proposals. I don't know if other panelists, other team members have answer to that as well, something that they want to add.
There's more questions. If not, it's okay. All right. More questions. Is there a way to describe how much support was needed relative to the number of targeted participants for the initial capacity building effort?
Funding for the participants. So for the initial capacity award, that was a combined grant that the manager of Hobos Bay and I, when I was at that time with Rookery Bay, submitted jointly. So we combined the two maximum amounts that each reserve could have. So that was $20,000 total. And out of that, we were able to support kind of cross-site participation of the project team members. So we had a group from Hobos Bay go to Rookery Bay and assess the damage from Hurricane Irma, and have some focus group discussions with our stakeholders in the region. I'm sorry, that happened second. First, the group from Florida went to Hobos Bay and did the same thing, looked at the impact of Hurricane Maria, stayed for a few days, and toured with the staff there, and then had focus group discussions with stakeholders in the area. And so that was the first time that a number of reserve practitioners actually had the opportunity to swap in both sites and really get on the ground understanding of what it was like in the other reserve. And that was then enabled us to be able to go forward and write a proposal together about what kind of work we wanted to do. And I see Marissa wants to add her 2 cents to that as well.
I did want to bring up something that I do think was a little bit unique, and it doesn't pertain so much to the capacity grant, but it did increase some of our capacity at the end of the project when we did have that science and management forum. We actually wrote it into the grant to allow for travel for our project advisory committee members to actually attend this meeting in person. And I do want to maybe even tag Danielle to talk about that a little bit more as well, because that was something that we heard was extremely unique that a lot of participants have never experienced before, and it made them feel very valued. So Danielle, I don't know if you wanted to chat about that real quick or not. Let's see.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up, Marissa. We were lucky as well with that at the same time we had that written into the science collaborative. That was something that I don't think all grants would fund that's something very much that the science collaborative said, yes, they would, we could do that. We could put that money aside and participant support costs. And I'm glad we did. And then what we found is, because we planned that out in 2020, and then, you get to 2024 and the cost of things are more. So we also received funds for additional capacity building that allowed us to bring the staff from the other reserves. So that was an additional $20K that each reserve jointly again went together and said, hey, we think this was really valuable to get these face-to-face meetings. We had so many virtual meetings, but we kind of got in, I think we had successful virtual meetings by the types of things that Marissa, said that we did in the way that, but there's something that you can't get the same without having these virtual, these in-person meetings. And so we really, it was very valuable, I think, to have the in-person meetings. But yes, we did have to put a good amount of the budget aside in order to do that. Hopefully that answers that person's question about capacity. Let us know if you have a follow-up.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It is true, we've heard before that capacity building funds do support stuff that might not otherwise be supported. So if you're looking at another funder, I encourage you to look for something similar, but I know we support that kind of work. Another question came in. This project has collected a lot of ecological data. Are there any plans to publish manuscripts?
Yes, there are several underway, including one that looks at as part of a special, going to be as part of the special issue of co-production that the folks at Restore are leading. That's going to be in Estuaries and Coast. We're working on that. We're also going to work on a manuscript related to our process of glossary building and definitions, as well as manuscripts associated with each of the other tasks. So the mangrove data, and then we have all this data. It will soon be available. That's an important point through the Neuroscience Collaborative. That you can, use on it. It'll be publicly available data not only on locations of the metrics that we collected in the field, but you can also see all the mosaics that were created from the change maps will also be available.
You can post the link to that page too. It'll also be included in the webinar summary stuff that goes out in the next few days. Another question came in. May have missed this during the presentation, so apologies if this has already been covered, but for the spatial habitat modeling with sat imagery, could that model be applied to other mangrove habitats with similar management goals?
I'm going to, Digna was having some technical difficulties earlier, so I'd like Digna, if you want to come off mute and kind of answer this question related to the habitat mapping, that would be great.
Yes. That all the methodology that we use for these maps, it was developed before for just for Rookery Bay for that area. And the new part that we did was to use the same methodology for Puerto Rico. And for Puerto Rico, we found that, for example, the classes of mangrove weren't separated with inland vegetation. So we realized that because the equations used for the program were made for Florida, we had to tweak that for using it in Jobos Bay. So I will say that in general, yeah, there is a possibility to use it in other regions, but it is necessary to make changes depending how is the reflectance of different vegetation in the region where you want to use it.
I see here Britta posted some papers in the chat as well.
Yeah, those are from the lab that Digna is part of. If anyone's interested in those related publications.
And one of the great things of these maps that we created was a time series. So they were annual maps. So it was incredibly useful to see changes a long time. That was what allows us to see the effect of the storms passing through those two places.
And if not, we can call it there as well. And you can also always ask follow-up questions via the exit survey as well. Maybe I'll start doing some housekeeping stuff. And if folks do have a last minute question they want to get in before we wrap up, feel free to type it in. But the webinar recording and everything from this session will be available in the next few days. Usually it just takes us a day or two to process the recording, add captions, all that fun stuff. Usually we'll type up the responses to the Q&A as well and include that with the slide deck on the page. The link to that summary page will go out automatically the next day, as soon as you leave the session, and also the next day at the same time the webinar started. So you'll be able to find all the resources there as well. I see another question came in here, so we'll ask that before we wrap up. Is it safe to say that mangroves responded similarly to the effect of the hurricane, both in Puerto Rico and Florida?
I'll take a crack at that. I'd say that there are, a lot of similarities between the locations. The really where we see them not recovering has to do with either a hydrologic restriction that was a result of the hurricane or prior hydrologic alterations. A lot of times where the forests were already under some stress, and in order for those areas that are not recovering to come back, there would have to be some type of intervention. And in both those cases, and those are primarily black mangrove forests in both reserves.
Thanks, Danielle. Okay. Well, then we'll transition to wrapping up. So a big thank you to our speakers today for taking the time to be with us and putting together this great presentation. As I said, the recording will be available in the next few days, so you can look out for that. If you go to the webpage and you don't see it, just, check back the next day or in a few hours or whatever. We're usually pretty quick about getting all this stuff processed and posted. So thank you to everybody for joining us today for today's session and for asking questions. And again, if you have any questions that you didn't answer in session that you'd like to see answered, you can feel free to reach out to us via the exit survey or via email. And with that, thank you to everyone and have a great day. And look out for the next webinar coming up in a couple of weeks. I believe it is April 15th.